And this time next year, on the third Monday in April, the world will return to this great American city to run harder than ever and to cheer even louder for the 118th Boston Marathon. Bet on it.
President Obama Thursday, thoughts echoed by Mayor Menino today. Let's talk more now about where we go next. On our roundtable with Senator Dan Coats, Republican on the Senate Intelligence Committee, Congressman Bennie Thompson, the ranking Democrat on the House Homeland Security Committee, Chief Global Affairs Correspondent for ABC, Martha Raddatz, Richard Haass, President of the Council on Foreign Relations, also author of the new book, Foreign Policy Begins at Home, and the editor of The New Yorker, David Remnick. Thanks to you all for joining us. And Senator, let me begin with you and the Congressman on these immediate questions on whether or not the suspect should be read his Miranda rights and treated as an enemy combatant.
I think we should stay with enemy combatant until we find out for sure whether or not there was a link to foreign terrorist organizations.
Even though he's a citizen?
Even though he's a citizen. There have been exceptions to this before with the public safety issue, of course, on Miranda rights, but also the fact that his travel back to his hometown, that was a Muslim area, could have been radicalized back there.
That was his brother, though.
The brother, that's
right.
Correct. But I mean, we're talking about the two of them together as to what happened and why it happened. And I think we ought to keep that option open until we find out whether or not there was a connection to terrorist organizations.
Do you agree?
I agree. There's no question. The public safety exception is there. We should utilize it. And we should get all the information available to us.
But how long does that public safety exception hold? I mean, even though a guy's lying flat on his back in a hospital bed?
Well, obviously, there are some communication issues right now because he can't talk. Obviously, we can do some other things. We still, I believe, have enough evidence. I don't think we should solely rely on the Mirandizing this candidate. He is clearly one of those individuals we have. What we need to do is collect the evidence, turn it over to the U.S. Attorney, prosecute him to the fullest extent of the law.
But you don't believe he should be treated as an enemy combatant going forward?
No.
And Senator,
unless there's the link.
Right, unless you find the link. But Senator, Mayor Menino also mentioned he may never be able to talk. You have some information on his wounds?
Information we have is that there was a shot to the throat, and it's questionable when and whether he'll be able to talk again. Doesn't mean he can't communicate, but right now I think he's in a condition where he can't get any information from him at all.
Nothing at all. Okay, well, thank you both very much on that particular thing. But let's talk more broadly about about the terrorist threat we're facing right now and how we deal with it. They talked, Martha Raddatz, about the possibility of a connection to overseas groups or an al-Qaeda connection. No evidence of that yet, but that could be the nightmare scenario.
It is a nightmare scenario, and that is where they're focused now. They're focused on whether there is an overseas connection, and an overseas connection in terms of whether the older brother got any training there. I think we have to talk about these missing years in a way. The Russians alerted the U.S. that he was radicalized, that he was involved in groups somewhere over there, they believed. That was 2011 when the FBI investigated.
At the request of the Russians.
At the request of the Russians. But then he goes back. So what happened before 2011 to alert the Russians? Was it visiting internet sites? Was it a specific group they were concerned about that he knew they were communicating with? And I think those missing years are what they're going to concentrate on, and whether that continued, whether he got trained by someone who right now is training someone else to do the same.
And David Remnick, of course, you spent a lot of time in Russia for the Washington Post, and everybody's going to be looking at these 6 months. We know his parents went back and lived in Russia for some time. From the mother, we've also heard that she says the FBI was on top of Tamerlan for several years.
Well, the parents moved back to Dagestan in order because the father wants to die there. He's very, very sick. That's the circumstance so far as we know, and we have no link between the parents and anything like jihadist interests at all. Mm-hmm. In fact, they seem to be utterly shocked and in disbelief. Now, the older brother has been visiting jihadist websites. I spent Friday looking at his YouTube list, and they are extremely frightening, ominous websites, pro-Al-Qaeda. There was one preacher that's going on and on about the evils of the magic of Harry Potter, all kinds of deluded things that he was involved in. The Twitter feed of the younger brother has hints of this kind of thing as well. So there's no question that they weren't merely religious. They were, which there's no sin in being religious, obviously, but interested in jihadist struggle. Global jihad is now the slogan in that region, in Dagestan, in Ingushetia, and Chechnya.
Although a statement coming out today from one of the groups in Dagestan saying our enemy is not the United States, our enemy is Russia. And that has been, we were talking to Richard Clark earlier, Richard Haas, about this, that area, hotbed of various Islamic cells, but the main fight for the Chechens and those in Dagestan has been against the Russian leadership.
It's absolutely true. Terrorism can be global, it can also be local. And historically, it was actually much more local than international. So I think the Chechen connection, if you will, is probably secondary here. You don't have to travel to be influenced by what is going on in the world. You know, the internet does it all for you. So I think that, yeah, the foreign connection is important, but probably more important is the alienation and the vulnerability of these kinds of young people who are in the United States, but they're not integrated into American society. What this reminds me of more than anything is the 2005 London bombings, where you had young Muslims of British, you know, they're born in Britain, they grew up there their whole lives, they went to British schools. Yeah, they had some foreign connections to Pakistan, but they were alienated from the society. So we as Americans need to look very hard at what we do to make sure that this sort of thing doesn't happen, that the leaders of these communities basically protect us from them and stop them before they do violence.
And what do they get when they're radicalized? They get this sense of importance. They get this sense of mission. They fit in themselves in their own way. And unfortunately for all of us, it's a rather evil way.
They play out a fantasy of fury and romantic nationalism for a place they've really never lived. I mean, if in fact it's Chechen nationalism or some kind of fantastical global jihad that they're interested in, there's no sense that these kids are well-read in this or well-versed.
Especially the younger
He
brother.
spent most of his time in
They're
America.
highly deluded, and so the connection between their rather idiotic interests and the evil acts that they carried out is still at this point a mystery.
Let me bring it back to the legislators here on that. Member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Senator, have you all been able to develop any information that gives you a better sense of when this moment of radicalization occurred?
Well, that's what's being investigated right now, and as thoroughly as possible, everything is being searched. All the agencies and all the intelligence agencies are playing into this along with the FBI, trying to find out whether there is a connection. It's a really important step that needs to be made. If there is a connection, whether there is or there isn't, I think what's happened here is that a signal has been sent to those who want to harm Americans. It is that we will do everything we can to prevent this from happening. And if you take on America, America's going to take you on. It's not just the intelligence agencies, it's just not the law enforcement, and I commend the coordination that pulled this thing together, but it's Americans. The runners in the race ran to help the victims. Boston response was extraordinary, like New York post 9/11. The signal is, don't mess with us. We will chase you to the ends of the earth if we have to. So we're trying to go to the ends of the earth to make sure that this wasn't something.
The problem here might have been, though, that they were just in the neighborhood.
Well, I think one of the problems, George, is that how do you deal with people who are already in this country? How do you deal with their radicalization? Is it on the internet? Is it their association with other friends? And that is something we are having to deal with every day. We've dealt with international terrorists who are trying to get here. But what about the people who are already here? We can't spend enough money to defend ourselves against that. We'll go broke as a nation. So that continues to be a day in, day out struggle.
Well, one of the questions that's come up is perhaps that more cities should do what New York does and invest in a lot more in counterterrorism on the ground. But then that can also get you very quickly into questions of civil liberties if you start just keeping an eye on neighborhoods or mosques, specific neighborhoods or mosques.
Well, you're absolutely right. But New York is one of the main beneficiaries of federal dollars. If it were not for the federal dollars, it would be very difficult for New York to be as robust as they are.
Yet we can't lock up every young man who goes on a fantastical or nasty or awful website. I mean, that becomes a big difficulty. In fact, we knew about this guy going
The
on his
FBI
website.
talked to him in 2011.
2011 interviews with him, and the parents readily admitted this in their interviews in Dagestan. So what do we do then? The Russians
Well, he
alerted
wasn't
us
tracked
to
to
this.
Russia. I assume that in 2012, no one was tracking him when he returned, and if he visited Chechnya, what he was doing there. It doesn't sound like anyone was tracking him there, and if you had that red flag raised, I think you do have to question why wasn't he followed up on?
But what this tells you is you need a long-term strategy for terrorism. What happened the other day in Boston, unfortunately, is not the exception. This is not a one-off. This is a glimpse of the future. This is granular terrorism that 1, 2, 3 people can carry out. We live in a world where power is diffused, where individuals are in turn empowered. So this, you don't need to do something on the scale of 9/11. That turns out to be much less difficult for us to find out about because there's so many people involved and there's so many traces.
And the senator
In fact,
pointed,
thankfully, it was an extremely crude operation. I mean, this bomb was so crude, thank God, that even people standing right next to the little boy who died were relatively unscathed. And so if it was in fact trained in Dagestan or Chechnya, as the supposition is now, and it's entirely supposition, it wasn't high-level training.
yet they did have a lot, they did have other weaponry we found out later, and some other bombs were discovered as well. But to get to the point that Richard Haas was just talking about, Senator, what do you do, though, if, you know, that no connection to a specific group is found? Instead, we just find that these young men were inspired by al-Qaeda, but not directed. That's almost impossible to find.
Well, it is, and that's the reality of the world we're now living in, because we not only face terrorism from abroad that is planned and coordinated, we face these lone wolves or these brothers or whoever gathers together that has a vengeance or has a demented mind or who has been kind of radicalized through over the internet or through a mosque or whatever. We're going to continue to have to understand that this is a threat to America also, but that's why we all need to be engaged in not only looking out for this type of thing, but helping identify and see whether these loners, is there a kid in the classroom that's just, you know,
He
something
wasn't a
happening
loner.
here?
He wasn't a
younger
loner.
brother.
The young
I
one
mean,
wasn't a loner.
You're not going to stop every one of these, that's for sure.
But the notion is unless you get the public buy-in, the public absolutely has to understand that to address this nexus to terrorism, they will have to participate. If they see something out of the ordinary, they're going to absolutely have to report it. If they don't report it, then potentially we would miss an opportunity to identify someone.
You know, that gets to a bigger question that was raised this week as well. I think one of the things we saw in the wake of the bombings on Monday is a lot of people saw things. A lot of people said things were on the internet. A lot of false information was being put out. We saw both the benefits of this crowdsourcing where everybody could come down on top of some suspects, but also the perils of it as well. Look at the front page of the New York Post just the other day. These two young men who had nothing to do at all with the terrorism. And Nightline actually spoke to one of them, Salah Barhoun, after the fact.
They're gonna be like, oh, you just did this. How could you do that? Why would you even do that? You got so many people you killed at 8 years old, kid. But if you look at it, it wasn't me.
He had nothing to do with it, and David Remnick, it does get...
It's outrageous behavior. Look, I have some sympathy for what happened to CNN. They're on all day long,
the arrest.
And they got what they thought were legitimate sources telling them that there was an arrest. They turned out to be wrong. They corrected their mistake. I wouldn't want to be in their shoes. This is something more pernicious. This is slapping on the front page of a newspaper with a wide circulation of something not confirmed at all, and it harms people's lives. And I give that guy a lot of credit, and then go on television and talk to you. I mean, that takes courage.
Actually, Rupert Murdoch responded in a tweet. He said that all the New York Post pictures were those distributed by the FBI and instantly withdrawn when the FBI changed directions. But Richard,
that's a lousy excuse. Sorry, that's a lousy excuse. It appeared on the front page of his newspaper. It was there for all to see, and it hurts that kid's life.
Take responsibility and apologize.
You bet.
But how do we deal with this going forward? Because we're going to see this again and again and again. It's so easy to get that bad information out there so quickly.
There's lots of things we've got to deal with. We actually need what the military would do, an after-action report. We got to look at the question of lockdown. Did Boston react properly? How did the law enforcement cooperation go? I think journalists, media, people on the internet need to look at what it was they did. Do normal standards apply? How do you remain competitive and at the same time remain responsible? With cameras everywhere, how do we cover things at the same time protect privacy? We're actually, again, this is the future. It's now come into the present. And what we're going to have to do is think through as a society how we're going to keep ourselves safe at the same time protecting civil liberties and not tying ourselves in knots. There's always balances. There's always trade-offs. That's the conversation we need to start
Martha, I
having.
felt some blowback on Friday. We, of course, were on the air from about 4 a.m. through 3 p.m., and then again all night long, and a lot of people saying to me personally, well, why do you guys
Just keep
give them,
talking?
just keep talking? Why do you give them that kind of attention?
Well, I think in a situation like that, first of all, you had an entire city locked down. You had to. You had this horrific event. And frankly, everybody was glued to the television. Everybody wanted to know what was happening. We have to be careful. We all have to be careful. I take the lesson of a former intelligence officer who said, when I was a young man, my dad took me deer hunting, and we were laying there and looked out, and my dad turned to me and he said, son, when you go deer hunting, everything starts looking like a deer. So we have to be careful. We have to make sure we don't have a confirmation bias that we want something to happen. CNN made a mistake. Law enforcement made a mistake. You remember when it first happened, they said there was an explosion at the JFK library.
And I think a lot of people were trying to be careful with this when you first saw the date that it happened on Patriots Day. Some speculation, oh, this was domestic terrorism, domestically inspired.
I used to work with Colin Powell. He once said, first reports he learned in the Army are never complete and never accurate. Not a bad thing to remember.
George, I think that you don't want us to legislate this issue. We'll leave it to the media and the journalists to figure out what they should do and what's proper.
But how about the question of the locking down the city of Boston, Congressman? You know, you saw the mayor right there say it was absolutely justified.
Well, if you study what terrorists want to do, one of the things other than the physical harm is the economic harm. That one day's loss of income for that area is in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So in some instance, the terrorists win there. And what we have to do is come up with the after-action reports and say what we need to do. And I think clearly, once we do that, there might be some alternatives, but I won't second-guess the governor or the mayor and what they did.
And if there were more terrorist attacks, it would have been much
and we say they did the right thing. But one of the goals of terrorists is economic terrorism, and if you look at it from that perspective, they succeeded.
And I take the mayor at his word that there were reports and possibilities of another bombing. These guys were still at large. But there is this question whether an entire city should be shut down, because in fact that's what terrorists want.
And
5 people are killed, but also an entire city is frozen with fear and anxiety. And this is it's horrible to say, but this is a great success for terrorists.
And that's why this after-action report, Richard, is so important, because we have seen in other instances, New York, after the Times Square bombing, did not lock down. We saw that renegade former cop in L.A. terrorizing people, the D.C. snipers many years ago. In all those cases, the cities did not lock down.
Right. You know, everyone here is right. Disruption is one of the goals of terrorists. They succeeded temporarily in this case. Obviously, though, you got to keep people safe. How you get that balance right. That's why it's so important to figure this out for the long term, because again, this is coming back. This is, what's scary about this is how relatively easy it is. And if these guys could go on the internet, use primitive, devices to do something like this, they're not the only ones who are going to do it. The attention they garnered is going to encourage copycat incidents. This is, terrorism is never going to be eradicated. It's like disease. And what we have to think about is, yeah, we go after it, but how do we make ourselves more resilient? How do we protect ourselves? How do we get better at bouncing back?
Not going to be eradicated, Martha Redis, but it does come at a time when the al-Qaeda leadership, top to bottom, has been pretty well decimated.
It's been decimated, which I think is frightening in a way because of exactly what happened, because they have these fragmented groups, these splinter groups, and really we can't prevent attacks on soft targets. We just can't. I think we probably all found ourselves this week looking around and thinking it could happen. Not 100%. And again, I think people talking about, let's get to the root of this. What happens to these young men? Is there anything we can do there? I don't know the answer to that. I just know you can't 100% prevent these attacks.
Senator, you were talking about the effect on legislation. We certainly can't legislate a lot of these issues, but one of the suggestions we've seen from one of your colleagues, Senator Charles Grassley of Iowa, is that we should put the immigration reform effort on hold until we know a lot more.
I agree with Senator Grassley.
Why?
You usually end up with bad policy if you do it in an emotional way or an emotional reaction. We saw some things post 9/11 that were enacted that if we had had a little more rational time to think this through, perhaps we wouldn't have had some of the pushback on it. But more importantly, immigration is an issue that has dramatic economic effect on Americans. It has national security implications. I think stepping back just a little bit and putting it on hold, for instance, we have a bigger issue than immigration in front of us, and that's our debt deficit, and it's got to get solved, and it's got to
Your
get solved.
colleague,
Another
Senator,
bigger issue for
I'm not saying
immigrants.
taking it out. We have a broken system. It needs to be reformed, but I'm afraid we'll rush to some judgments relative to immigration and how it's processed. So let's do it in a rational way rather than an emotional way.
George, with respect, I think that's as bad an idea as calling this an enemy combatant. We have a 100% success rate of prosecuting terrorists in the United States. 100%. And I think that's a bad idea on the part of Senator McCain in the lead. I think the idea of delaying immigration reform, if you ask anybody involved with immigration, including the immigrants themselves, this is a horrible idea to take this isolated, horrible, violent, evil incident and make it stand for a larger politics and put immigration reform, put the brakes on it.
where do you stand on that, Congressman?
Well, it is not the right thing to do. We're a nation of immigrants. I trust our government. We vet people up and down. We review policies every day, but to put it on hold is not in the best interest of this country.
I agree with the Congressman. One of the things the immigration reform bill will deal with is the 11 or 12 million people who are in this country but are still living in the shadows. One of the lessons of this incident, we need to integrate all Americans into this society. We want to mainstream them. Rather than delaying the bill, I actually think we should move it even faster. And we thought about this for years, economically, but also in terms of our national security. This bill will help make America safer because more Americans will come into the mainstream, will no longer be forced to live in some twilight shadowed area. That's one of the lessons we ought to take from this. Alienated young people, not part of the mainstream fully, dangerous thing.
Well, I think I'm the last person on the opposite side of all this, but I'm simply saying just push it back a month or two, let the emotions settle down, let us do it in a rational way and make good judgments, not based on the urgency of the moment. Congress has a way of just rushing to judgments without thinking it through carefully. We're talking months here or a few weeks, not years.
And that is all we have time for today. Thank you all for a very thoughtful discussion. Coming up, author Dennis Lehane on the spirit of his hometown in our Sunday Spotlight.
I have a lot of pride